At my husband's 40th birthday celebration, his mother clinked her champagne glass and announced I had been unfaithful for years. The room fell silent as 200 guests turned to stare at me. My husband's hand tightened around his glass until it shattered, and before I could speak, he grabbed my arm and shoved me backward into the dessert table. Cake and champagne splattered across my ivory dress as I hit the floor. I lay there among the ruins of the elaborate display, feeling the cold marble beneath my back, while he turned away to accept his mother's comforting embrace. That is when I started laughing. It was not hysterical or broken laughter, but a slow, knowing chuckle that rose from my chest and echoed through the stunned ballroom. My husband froze, mid-step, and his mother's perfectly composed face flickered with fear for the first time in 3 years. The morning had started like any other Saturday in our penthouse overlooking Central Park. Gray November light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows that cost more than most people's houses. At 40, Marcus still looked like the man who had swept me off my feet at a charity gala 7 years ago, but his eyes had changed. Where there was once warmth, I now saw only a strange emptiness that appeared after his father's death 3 years ago. When he wished me a happy birthday, his voice came out rehearsed and hollow. I watched him move across his phone screen in patterns I had memorized. Slow, deliberate typing meant he was communicating with his mother. Our relationship had drifted so far that we had not shared a bed intimately in 18 months. I retreated to my dressing room, which was the only space in our home without the surveillance cameras his mother had insisted we install. I had discovered hidden lenses embedded in smoke detectors, picture frames, and even the antique clock in our bedroom. I left them all functional, but became an expert at feeding Eleanor exactly what she wanted to see. I played the part of a devoted daughter-in-law and a perfect society wife, while hiding my real life behind a false panel. My name is Vivian Chen Ashford, and I am a former federal prosecutor. For 3 years, I had been building a case that would bring the Ashford dynasty to its knees. I kept 3 burner phones and encrypted laptops containing over 4,000 documents, photographs and recordings as my insurance policy against the woman who was trying to destroy me. When I met Marcus, I thought I had found my person. He was kind and passionate about using his wealth for actual good. His mother, Eleanor, seemed welcoming at first, but the mask slipped exactly 3 weeks after our wedding when Marcus' father died suddenly. The family doctor called it a heart attack, but buried in medical records, I found evidence of a lethal injection. Richard Ashford had been planning to divorce Eleanor after discovering she was the architect of a financial empire built on fraud and manipulation. After his death, Marcus began attending sessions with a psychiatrist his mother recommended. Within 6 months, the man I married had become someone I barely recognized. He was distant compliant, and his eyes would go vacant as he was systematically conditioned by his own mother to ensure her complete control of the family empire. Pattern recognition was my job for 15 years, and I knew exactly what psychological manipulation looked like. I watched with growing horror as my husband was systematically broken down. It started with small things like Marcus suddenly hating restaurants he used to love, or cutting off friends his mother disapproved of. He began checking in with Eleanor multiple times a day, and these calls always left him agitated and confused. Eventually, he signed over power of attorney to her and moved foundation assets into accounts she controlled. I once found him staring blankly at a video message from her, repeating phrases I could barely hear. I knew then that confrontation would be useless, because Eleanor had spent decades perfecting her techniques. Marcus would defend her without knowing why, and I would be isolated and eliminated. I began documenting everything with prosecutorial precision. I traced payments to Dr. Vance, which were categorized as consulting fees, but totaled over $2 million. I found research papers Vance had published decades ago on behavioral modification techniques that were denounced by the medical community, but clearly found a wealthy patron in Eleanor. I discovered shell companies funneling money from the Ashford Foundation into her private accounts and bribes to city officials used to destroy business competitors. Most chilling were the patterns of others who had tried to expose her. Business partners were driven to bankruptcy, and a previous daughter-in-law had died in a suspicious car accident after filing for divorce. Eleanor Ashford was a predator who had finally turned her weapons on her own son. By 7 in the morning, it was time to become the perfect accessory again. Tonight at the Plaza Ballroom, Eleanor would spring whatever trap she had been preparing. I had seen the signs for a month, including secret meetings with her lawyers and whispered conversations that left Marcus more vacant than usual. There was a new intensity in the way she watched me, as if measuring me for a coffin. But I was ready. My contacts at the FBI were standing by, and my evidence package was loaded onto a dead man's switch linked to my phone's GPS. One wrong move or one act of violence would trigger a simultaneous broadcast to federal authorities and every major news outlet in the country. For the evening, I selected a deep burgundy gown. Eleanor had texted specific instructions for me to wear a pale blue dress she had gifted me, which, like everything she gave, came with invisible strings. My choice of burgundy was a small rebellion, but these small acts of defiance were what kept me sane while I assembled my case. When we arrived at the plaza, the ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and 200 of New York's elite. It was a room full of politicians and financiers who either owed Eleanor favors or feared her wrath. Not one of my true friends or family members had been invited. Eleanor had curated this guest list to ensure I would have no allies when she finally moved against me. Eleanor glided toward us the moment we entered, resplendent in silver Chanel and wearing an expression of maternal warmth that I knew was a mask. At 68, she remained a striking figure who was photographed for society pages, but feared in boardrooms. When her gaze flickered to my burgundy gown, I saw a flash of displeasure because I had ignored her instructions to wear the blue dress. She linked her arm through mine and led me through the crowd, pointing out important guests like Senator Morrison and Judge Blackwell. I knew these people were all on the Ashford payroll in ways that would be very interesting to federal investigators. I played my role perfectly while tracking 3 specific people, Eleanor, Dr. Vance, and a silver-haired man I did not recognize. I drifted closer to the silver-haired man, who was in an intense conversation with Eleanor's personal attorney. I overheard the attorney saying that the documentation was complete and that they could proceed with a conservatorship filing on Monday morning. They discussed how Eleanor had video evidence that would make any contest inadvisable because my history of instability would be well documented by then. I understood in that moment that tonight was not just about public humiliation. Eleanor was planning to have me declared mentally unfit to strip away my legal standing so thoroughly that any accusations I made would be dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed woman. The affair announcement was just the opening salvo to create a public record of my alleged betrayal. My phone buzzed silently with a message from my FBI contact, who was standing by and ready. I typed back for them to hold for my signal, as I might need evidentiary support tonight. The dinner bell chimed and guests moved toward their assigned tables. I found my seat next to Marcus, directly across from Dr. Vance, while Eleanor commanded the head of the table like a queen on her throne. Her eyes constantly tracked me, as if cataloging my every expression. Before the meal began, Eleanor tapped her champagne flute with a silver knife to get everyone's attention. She announced how proud she was of her son for carrying the Ashford legacy with dignity for 40 years. Marcus smiled mechanically, but I noticed his left hand tapping a specific pattern against the tablecloth. It was the same stress response I had documented dozens of times, which was always triggered by his mother's proximity. Eleanor continued her speech, saying that marriage is sacred and that it pained her to share what she had discovered about the woman her son called his wife. The room fell silent, and 200 faces turned toward me with predatory interest. Eleanor claimed she had protected her son from the truth for 3 years, but could no longer stay silent. She pulled out her phone and held up a photograph of me hugging a former colleague at a birthday party, which she had twisted through angle and context into something sordid. Eleanor claimed with rehearsed sorrow that I had been unfaithful, and gasps rippled through the crowd of New York elite. I watched my husband's face and saw the programmed response kick in, exactly as he had been conditioned. His jaw tightened and his eyes went flat, as if the real Marcus had been replaced by a machine. Eleanor leaned close to him and whispered just loud enough for me to hear that he must remember his duty and protect what belonged to the family. For a fleeting second, I saw genuine confusion in his eyes, as the man I married struggled to surface from beneath layers of psychological programming. But the struggle was short-lived, and it was replaced by a cold and terrifying certainty. Marcus demanded to know if the accusation was true, while his voice carried across the silent ballroom. I looked at him and told him to listen carefully, because the photograph was taken at a public birthday party, and I could prove it. I told him his mother had manipulated every piece of evidence she was showing him. Eleanor hissed that I was a liar, and her mask began to slip as desperation showed in her eyes. She claimed to have documentation and witnesses to my betrayal, and then she gave Marcus a look that signaled the next phase of her plan. Marcus grabbed my arm and shoved me with a force that sent me stumbling backward into the massive dessert table. Crystal and china shattered around me as I crashed to the floor. Champagne soaked through my burgundy gown, and I lay among the ruins of a 5-tier cake, while the silence in the room became absolute. 200 members of high society stared in frozen shock at the heir to the Ashford fortune standing over his wife like an executioner. I felt the impact register on my phone sensors, and I knew my dead man's switch was armed and ready to go live. But I realized I did not need the automatic system anymore because I had everything I needed right there in front of all those witnesses. I started laughing because the irony of the situation was too perfect to ignore. My laughter began as a soft chuckle and grew until it echoed through the silent ballroom, carrying every ounce of bitter triumph I had kept hidden for 3 years. Marcus froze, mid-step, and his mother's face went pale beneath her perfect makeup. I rose to my feet and brushed the cake from my ruined silk gown, not caring about the mess. I looked directly at Eleanor and thanked her for setting this up better than I ever could have tried. Confusion clouded her face, because this was not in her script. The humiliated wife was supposed to cry and plead for mercy, which would support the narrative of mental instability. She was not supposed to stand up and laugh in the face of her attackers. Eleanor demanded to know what I was talking about, while her voice lost its cultured smoothness and became shrill. I turned to address the crowd, falling into the courtroom rhythms I had perfected over 15 years as a federal prosecutor. I told everyone in the room that they had just witnessed Marcus Ashford commit physical assault under his mother's direct instruction. I pointed to the dozens of smartphones still raised in shock, and reminded the guests that the attack was captured on camera in front of 200 witnesses. Eleanor sputtered that I was clearly unhinged, and told Marcus to help me because I was having a mental episode, but Marcus was not moving. He was staring at his hands as if seeing them for the first time, and his eyes had lost their flat emptiness. I saw horror and confusion surfacing in my husband as he whispered my name and asked why he had done that. I turned back to Eleanor and watched fear bloom across her features as I announced to the crowd that they should check their phones. I told them that some had already received an email in the last 30 seconds, while others would receive it within the hour. The first notification chime sounded from the back of the room, followed by another, and then a cascade of pings and buzzes as my evidence package began arriving in inboxes across the ballroom. Judge Blackwell stared at his phone with a face gone gray and asked what this was. I replied calmly that it was 3 years of documentation proving the truth. I told the room that the evidence proved Eleanor Ashford orchestrated the murder of her husband Richard, and that she had been systematically conditioning her son through a psychiatrist named Harold Vance. I explained that she used techniques classified as psychological torture, and that the Ashford Foundation had laundered approximately $400 million through fraudulent programs. I swept my gaze across the panicking crowd and told them that many of them had been complicit in covering up her crimes. Dr. Vance began edging toward the exit, but I called out to him directly. I told him he should stay because the FBI agents arriving in the lobby would have questions about the coercive psychological programming he applied to a patient without consent. Vance froze as his clinical detachment vanished and was replaced by the panicked calculation of a man whose alibis were crumbling. Eleanor screamed that this was insane, and that I was fabricating everything, but her voice had lost its power. She begged Marcus to tell everyone I was a liar, but Marcus had sunk into a chair with his head in his hands. His body shook with tremors as years of suppressed memories began breaking through the conditioning. He started muttering about the sessions and the videos and the words she made him repeat. He confessed that he couldn't think or choose because everything she said felt true, even when he knew it was not. I knelt beside Marcus despite the ache from hitting the floor and told him gently that what he was feeling was the conditioning breaking down. I explained that his mother and Dr. Vance had been programming his responses since his father's death, using medication and repetitive verbal commands to punish independent thought. Marcus looked at me with eyes that finally saw me and asked what had really happened to his father. Silence fell over the ballroom once more, as Eleanor's face contorted with a mixture of rage and terror. I told him the truth that his father had discovered who Eleanor really was and intended to divorce her and expose her financial crimes, so she had him killed. I revealed that the family physician had administered a lethal injection, and the payment records were in the evidence package I had just distributed. Eleanor screamed that I was an ungrateful woman who had corrupted her son and destroyed the family name. But no one was looking at her with respect anymore. The ballroom doors swung open and 4 people in dark suits entered with the efficient calm of federal law enforcement. Agent Patricia Reyes, my primary contact from the FBI, led the way. She announced to the stunned crowd that Eleanor Ashford was under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. Eleanor demanded to know if the agents knew who she was and threatened to destroy them. But Agent Reyes replied that they knew exactly who she was, and that was why they were there. The room watched in a daze as handcuffs were placed on the woman who had ruled New York society for decades. Her silver Chanel gown looked out of place against the metal restraints as she was led away. Dr. Vance was detained near the exit, and his protests about patient confidentiality were ignored as agents secured his devices. Several guests attempted to slip away, only to find more agents blocking the doors and taking names. Marcus sat motionless through the chaos, staring at his mother as if seeing her for the very first time. He whispered that all those years he thought he believed and felt things, but now he wondered if any of it had been real. I touched his arm carefully and told him that the beginning was real when we first met and fell in love, but that Eleanor had tried to erase that person. Marcus looked at his hands and whispered in horror that he had attacked his own wife in front of everyone. I explained that he was responding to a trigger command she had programmed into him years ago, and that his conscious mind had no control over his actions. He looked at me with the first genuine emotion I had seen in 3 years, and asked why I had stayed and why I hadn't just left when I realized what was happening. I told him it was because I loved who he was before his mother got to him, and because I couldn't let her do to anyone else what she had done to his father and her previous victims. Someone had to stop her, and I was the only one in a position to do it. The elegant ballroom had transformed into a crime scene, as guests gave statements and phones were collected as evidence. The elaborate birthday celebration had been reduced to chaos, and the man I had hired to photograph our reconciliation story ended up capturing the downfall of the Ashford empire instead. Tomorrow the papers would lead with the news of the arrest and the scandal that had rocked the city. 8 months later, I sat in a federal courtroom watching Eleanor Ashford receive her sentence. She was no longer wearing designer clothes and perfect makeup, but was dressed in orange jail scrubs. She still looked defiant, believing her money and connections would save her, but they did not. The judge sentenced her to 34 years for conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and fraud, meaning she would be nearly 100 before she was eligible for parole. Dr. Vance had turned state's evidence within weeks of his arrest, trading his testimony about the conditioning techniques for a reduced sentence. His detailed records proved invaluable in understanding what had been done to Marcus and in building the case against Eleanor. He received 12 years and lost his medical license permanently. The Ashford Foundation was dissolved, and its legitimate charitable functions were transferred to new organizations with proper oversight. The fraudulent assets totaling nearly $500 million were traced to offshore accounts and redistributed to the victims Eleanor had spent decades destroying. This included former employees who had lost their careers and business partners, driven to bankruptcy, as well as the family of Richard Ashford's first daughter-in-law, whose death was being officially reinvestigated. I found Marcus waiting outside the courthouse, looking thinner but more present than I had seen him in years. He was wearing casual clothes instead of the tailored suits his mother had always insisted upon. He had spent the last 6 months in a residential treatment program, specializing in recovery from coercive control. The process had been slow and painful, but ultimately transformative for him. He told me the trial was over, and I agreed that the rest of our lives was just beginning. We walked together toward the park and found a bench overlooking the river where the late spring sun was warm. It reminded me of the day we first met nearly 8 years ago in what felt like a different lifetime. Marcus told me that his therapist said he needed to stop apologizing, but he didn't know how to not feel responsible for what he had done to me. I reminded him that he was as much a victim as anyone else, and that his mother had weaponized him against me. He argued that he should have seen it sooner, and that he let her isolate me and control our lives until I had to become a one-woman investigation unit just to survive. I told him we were both manipulated and we both survived, and that what mattered now was what we did next. He watched the boats on the river and told me he had been asked to join the advisory board for a new foundation, helping victims of coercive control and funding research into recovery programs. He said he wanted to tell his story publicly so that other people, especially men, would understand that psychological abuse can happen to anyone. I warned Marcus that telling his story would not be easy, and that people might doubt him or say he should have fought back. He smiled with the first genuine warmth I had seen since his father's death, and told me I had taught him that truth has power even when it is ugly. He said if I could spend 3 years building a case against untouchable people, then he could find the courage to speak his truth. We sat in comfortable silence as the afternoon light shifted across the water. The question of our marriage remained unresolved, because too much had happened and too much healing remained to be done. But there was something between us that had survived the trauma. I told him I had resigned from the foundation board to start a new organization providing legal advocacy and pro bono representation for victims of coercive control. Marcus reached out and took my hand, which was the first voluntary physical contact since his recovery began. He told me that my choice to stay and fight when I could have walked away had saved his life and gave him the chance to become a real person again. I squeezed his hand and told him that giving each other chances is all any of us can do. We stayed on that bench as the sun set, 2 survivors of the same storm, finding our way back to shore. 6 months later, the Marcus Ashford Foundation for Psychological Freedom held its inaugural gala in a simple community center in Brooklyn. There were no corrupt officials or society predators this time. We served coffee and homemade desserts, and invited advocates and survivors from across the country. Marcus spoke publicly for the first time, and his voice shook as he described the sessions with Dr. Vance and the way his thoughts had been replaced with programmed responses. But his voice grew steady as he talked about the slow process of discovering who he actually was beneath the conditioning. I watched from the back of the room as men and women approached him afterward because they recognized their own experiences in his story. He found me later exhausted but looking lighter than ever before. He admitted it was harder than he expected, but incredibly important. Then he asked the question that had been hanging between us for months, about where we would go from here. I told him honestly that I did not know and that we both needed more time, but I also did not want to close any doors. He nodded and accepted that not closing doors was enough for now. I thought about Eleanor serving her 34-year sentence in a federal facility, and about her empire being dismantled and redistributed to those she had harmed. What had started as a desperate bid for survival had become a foundation that would help thousands of people. The woman who had laughed on the ballroom floor, covered in champagne and rage, had not known what the future held, but she knew truth was worth fighting for. Now I knew that truth does not just expose lies, it creates the space for becoming whoever you were meant to be before someone tried to break you.